Actually, it all worked out.
Okay. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. If I can have your attention, please. Yes. Hello. Hi. Okay, I am going to introduce our speaker. So Professor Algee-Hewitt from Stanford. His work predominantly centers in 18th and 19th century literature as he combines literary critical approaches with quantitative textual analysis to explore the early intersection between literature and aesthetic theory. His current project seeks to explain the sudden rise and even more rapid fall of the sublime in the long 18th century. He is co-director of the Literary Lab at Stanford, along with Franco Moretti, and he leads a diverse range of projects which include investigations into the textual basis for the experience of suspense, the emergence of genre in the 18th century, the narrative aspects of climate change legislation in the U.S. Supreme Court, and the history of poetic form. And today his talk is, as you can see, The Disorder of Discourse, Digital Models for an Aesthetic Literary Theory. So please welcome Professor Algee-Hewitt.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you all for coming and for having me. Before I launch into the talk proper, a couple preliminary notes. What I want to present to you today is a combination of three things that I'm either recently or currently or will be soon working on, all of which are united by a common theme, which I've tried to encapsulate in my title, and which will hopefully become slightly more apparent to you as we talk. But I also wanted to show the different kinds of stages that these kinds of projects go through. The first, my project in the Sublime, is limping its way towards completion. Hopefully it's a book someday, in the near future. The second, a kind of pushback on Bakhtin, is sort of in its full flower. And the last, where this notion of disorder really comes into play, is, let's say, highly experimental, to the point where no one outside my own department has ever heard me say anything about it. So I wanted to use this opportunity to sort of bring it out and hopefully get some impressions from a fresh audience. So without further ado, The Disorder of Discourse, Digital Models for an Aesthetic Literary Theory. It is the 38th lecture of his Lectures on Rhetoric and Belles Lettres. Hugh Blair shifts his focus from the apparatus of rhetoric to a discussion of poetics by revealing the disputed nature of what should be a categorical difference. Quote, "Our first enquiry must be, what is poetry, and wherein does it differ from prose? The answer to this question is not so easy as first might be imagined, and critics have differed and disputed much concerning the proper definition of poetry." First published in 1783, a critical moment in the history of prose fiction. Blair's hedging reflects the uncertain status of poetry between the Enlightenment and the Romantic period, as new strategies of publication and circulation reflected and reinforced the novel's growing influence on the reading public. That he initially articulates the question of poetry as one of differentiation between poetry and prose, rather than between lyric and epic or between ancient and modern poetry, suggests that Blair himself, following such other critical thinkers as Clara Reeve, was aware of the changing status of poetry as it reacted to the developments in prose fiction during the later 18th century. For us, it also reveals the historical specificity of the question that Blair poses. The nature of the difference between poetry and prose is both categorical and chronological. We can no longer simply ask with Blair, what is poetry? But instead we must ask, what is the history of the relationship between prose and poetry, and how can we reconcile the evolution of this relationship with the critical apparatus of aesthetics, which has sought to define this difference as absolute? In my talk today, I want to broadly trace the historical dimensions of this question by exploring two new approaches, and one slightly less new, to the discursive differences between poetry and prose in the long 18th and 19th centuries, and a good part of the 17th century as well. one that's based in an operational approach to the theory of Mikhail-Bakhtin, and the other, a new intervention into poetics by the way of information theory. Both, however, combine the quantitative analytics of the digital humanities with a detailed understanding of literary theory. Not only do I argue that these methods give us the ability to trace these literary effects at new levels of historical specificity, but they also offer us alternative ways to measure this difference, unavailable to traditional methods of literary criticism that, when taken themselves as objects of interpretation, can offer us new purchase on this complex and problematic question. At the same time, I also want to demonstrate how such a computer-assisted reading not only benefits from, but is dependent upon the complex literary theory and textual theory that are the basis of our discipline. Now, the origins of my interest in the poetics of the long 18th century lie in my previous project, The Afterlife of the Sublime. In this project, too, my goal was to negotiate an approach to the sublime that avoided both the universalizing tendencies of literary theory and the discontinuities inherent in literary history. Most critical studies of the sublime in the 20th century either seek to create a catalog of its historical particularity or generalize the term into a coherent concept within a subset of 18th century or Romantic period works. For a concept such as the sublime that is not only present, but also remains highly contentious for the duration of the 18th century and a good portion of the 17th and 19th as well, I argue that both modes of analysis are necessary. The history of the usage of the term is no less important than the meanings it accumulates throughout its appearances in the writing of all of those periods. My turn to the digital in this project was motivated by my desire to move outside of this dichotomy and understand the sublime not as a word with one or many different definitions, but as something that is shaped by and in turn alters the semantic contexts in which it is embedded. My turn to the lexical suggests a different way of understanding what we as scholars mean when we reference the concept of the sublime, and it readjusts our thinking of what the sublime is. I argue that the sublime can best be understood as a pattern of language, a discourse that marks a particular way of writing, one that has specific goals. To recover this pattern, I turn to the methods of computational linguistics. With a corpus of 13,354 digitized works, including poetry, prose, and critical philosophic writing, all written between 1650 and 1850, I performed a collocation analysis and identified the words that are used frequently in the vicinity of the sublime, and yet are relatively infrequent elsewhere. This, the resulting list of 150 terms, is what I call the language of the sublime, and I argue that its appearance best represents the sublime itself as it functions within specific texts in specific historical instances. Even more critically, these words, I discovered, appeared only within specific patterns in the writing of the long 18th century. By uncovering the correlations between these terms, by examining which words appeared frequently together in the same texts, I was able to uncover clusters of terms that form the multiple subdiscourses of the sublime and which legislate its appearance within specific texts. Moreover, my digital analysis revealed highly interpretable results. Across my sample, patterns emerged that reflected aspects of the sublime that are recognizable to those familiar with its critical theory. For example, what I'm here calling Group 2, the Burkean sublime, Group 2 of the 9 groups I identified, is composed of words that seem to belong to the physiology of the sublime that Burke describes in his philosophical inquiry, including both anatomical attributes, eye, voice, hands, and head, as well as physical forces, light, air, sound. Words belonging to Group 3 include elements of the discourse of theology, God, soul, heaven, and sacred. Finally, groups of 6, 9, and 10 all contain words that can be associated with artistic, or more specifically poetic creation, including style, subject, verse, poem, and imagination. It is essential to remember, however, that this language, although forming stable patterns across the long 18th century, is subject to historical change. While the words remain the same, the patterns of their relationships shift. The sublime evolves. To explore this evolution, I made one final turn, from the linear logic of the word list to the spatial logic of the topology. By transforming the virtual distances of correlation into actual physical distances within an imaginary space, I created what I'm calling a topology of the sublime, a virtual map of the associations between words at specific points in its history. This visualization of the language of the sublime, each tile here is one of those words that I showed on the very first slide. It codes the specific relationships between terms during this period as literal distances. The closer any two tiles representing terms appear on the map, the more often they are likely to appear together within the vicinity of the word sublime during the specific period represented. Here, the period between 1660 and 1729. The smaller the tile, the more embedded the term within the surrounding cluster. The colors represent the groups of terms that I identified in those groups before that are the most significant groups across the 2 centuries, represented by my corpus. By juxtaposing the arrangements of these overall groups with the clustering of terms within individual periods, we can visually trace the evolution and disintegration of these discourses. As we move from this, the early century, to the middle of the period, and then to the final period represented by my corpus, 1780 to 1850, we can witness how and when individual discourses formed. For example, that set of Burkean terms that I identified, here colored light blue, are scattered throughout the early century, and I've made the other terms faded so you can see where those blue terms or those Burkean terms are. But as we move forward, they achieve a remarkable coherence after 1780, which was really interesting because that's actually 30 years after Burke published the inquiry, suggesting, I want to say, the amount of time it takes for the discourse that Burke introduces into the discussion of the sublime to actually achieve uptake in the language of the period. On the other hand, the discourses of rhetoric and poetics actually lose coherence as we move across the century, becoming more and more intermingled in what I argue is the burgeoning of the discipline of aesthetics. By combining digital approaches with a critical understanding of aesthetic and literary history, I was able to trace this discourse through the texts of the long, long 18th century, both in locations where the word sublime appears, and more importantly, in locations when it is absent. This revealed connections between texts across the period in their manipulation of this language, and connections that were not apparent to critical interpretation alone. For example, in Swift's Tale of a Tub and Blake's Jerusalem, here each peak represents a chunk of the text, and the dot is the percentage of words from that chunk that are made up of these words of the sublime. The highest points in these graphs, the highest points of the sublime, occur in Swift when the author turns his attention from the allegorical narrative to a direct address to the reader. These are those peaks, which are Swift's digressions in Tale of a Tub. In Blake's Jerusalem, it's 3 of the 4 addresses, those other parts of the text that speak directly to the reader that foreground or give a preface to each of the 4 books of Jerusalem. The argument that I make throughout the project is that the language of the sublime becomes embedded into the emerging practice of criticism as it becomes a crucial term for the allocation of literary value by the 19th century. The disappearance of the term at the end of the Romantic period, the central question that motivated this project, can thus be partly explained by the transformations of its discourse, whose patterns remain stable, into a functional language of literary criticism. I told you that story, so I can tell you this one. In the course of this project, I realized that one of the central assumptions in my argument, namely that the discourse of the sublime functions the same across written media, itself contained an embedded theory of the commonalities between poetry and prose. Namely, that such commonalities exist and that they remain constant across the long 18th century. Given that such a distinction was a primary object of concern for 18th century aesthetic theories, such as we've seen in Blair, my current project seeks to trace the historical dimension of this difference, both as it is theorized and more centrally as it takes shape in the interplay of literary genres throughout the period. For example, these 2 passages, one from Godwin's Caleb Williams, the one in which Caleb has been falsely imprisoned at the behest of Falkland, and the other from Shelley's Mont Blanc, nominally have the same subject: the imaginative power of mind and the tension between its psychical freedom and physical limitations. Moreover, both speakers are deeply concerned with the capacity of the imagination for literary production. Caleb's concern over the sociopolitical power of narrative throughout the text is echoed in Shelley's interrogation to the source of poetic creativity and its negotiation within the real world. Moreover, both passages exhibit a relatively high percentage of words drawn from the language of the sublime, as I have identified it before, here highlighted in red. Given the similarities of the subjects and the amount of text implicated in the discourse of the sublime, I argue here that the sublime is doing the same work, or at least I would have argued here that the sublime is doing the same work. In this case, the argument would have gone, Shelley's use of the sublime as a way to articulate the radical doubt inherent in the process of poetic representation is reflected in Godwin's use of the same language to theorize the difficulty in linking imaginative creation to real-world action. Yet even within this example, the pattern of each author's deployment of the language of the sublime is surprisingly different. Something that becomes apparent when we begin to apply pressure on the reading I have just given using our new digital tools. As Steve Ramsey has argued, one of the strengths of what he calls algorithmic criticism lies in its ability to do what he calls deform the text, and thereby reveal, through a new digital hermeneutics, new objects for critical inquiry. Here, I am primarily concerned with the pattern of the sublime and non-sublime words. Although important for a final analysis, as well it should be, the content features, the actual words themselves, impede our ability to visualize semantic patterns at this resolution. If instead, therefore, we substitute a series of abstract symbols for words, we can more clearly observe the lexical patterns. Here, each block represents a word in the passage, and the color indicates whether or not it belongs to the discourse of the sublime. Yellow blocks are sublime words, and gray ones are not. Through this transformation, and this is the same text, each block represents one word in those passages I just showed, both of which had, made sure, equal numbers of words. Through this transformation, the difference between the two becomes clear. Although both contain a similar percentage of sublime words, the distribution of the discourse in the novel is distinctly different from that of the poem. So, for example, in these two lines, while the sublime appears in densely populated clusters of words in Shelley's texts, in Godwin's, the sublime is distributed throughout. Given this difference, therefore, the argument that both texts do the same work, at least in terms of the sublime, seems to be problematic at best. In other words, if we understand poetry or prose as technologies of mediation, then, following McLuhan, or paraphrasing him, the technology itself is deeply implicated in the message. This is particularly true in the Romantic period, in which Shelley's, quote, unacknowledged legislators of the world, and in Germany Friedrich Schlegel's decree that poetry alone is free, reveal the importance of mediation within Romantic poetics. What this project aims to do, therefore, is to tease apart how the mediating function of poetry and prose differs, both theoretically and historically, and to reconstruct a new history of their coevolution. For a digital investigation or a critical analysis equally, the work of Bakhtin can offer a point of access to understanding the differences between the discursive work of poetry and prose. In Discourses in the Novel, Bakhtin proposes that we understand the novel as a genre of accumulation and mixture, resulting in a heterogeneous object of multiple and overlapping language, linked in his history of novelistic discourse to a series of cultural and linguistic interpenetrations, for example, the Roman translation of Greek mythology. The novel for Bakhtin is a mixture of language systems which are functionally distinct even while they work together towards a single representational aesthetic goal. As opposed to poetry, which Bakhtin describes as a closed and circumscribed genre dominated by a single unitary voice, the novel contains within itself both its own self-critique and a meta-commentary on its identity as both fiction and artistic object. Novels are therefore stylistically distinct from poetry, according to Bakhtin, as both operate within their own stylistic ecology. The single voice dominating the poetic endeavor, whether tragedy, epic, or lyric, and the plurality of voices, what Bakhtin calls heteroglossia, being the defining characteristic of the novel. As he says right here, diversity of voices and heteroglossia enter the novel and organize themselves within it into a structured artistic system. This constitutes the distinguishing feature of the novel as a genre. With this theory, Bakhtin proposes a practice of classification that is built into the stylistics of writing itself. By reversing his practice, reverse engineering his practice, we can, if his theory holds, use a scale of heteroglossia, or polyvocality, as a way of distinguishing between novels and poetry. If, therefore, we had a way to reliably measure the diversity of voices within a sample of both poetry and prose, we could not only test if there is a difference along this axis between them, but also if this difference corresponds to Bakhtin's theory. What we require, therefore, in Franco Moretti's words, is an operationalization of Bakhtin's heteroglossia, recasting the theory of the novel he describes as a set of operations that we can use to measure a text, thereby allowing us to move from a subjective qualitative judgment of whether or not a text is polyvocal to a set of quantitative practices that can place a text on a scale of polyvocality. If a novel is a site of competing and differentiating discourses, then it stands to reason that these multiple discourses would leave traces within the semantics of the text itself. Two different discourses should employ two different syntactical and lexical fields and would be recognizable through the linguistic dissimilarity. The more different discourses, the more polyvocal and heteroglossic the text, and the more likely, according to Bakhtin, that the text is a novel. In literary quantitative analysis, moreover, we already have a set of practices that enable us to measure the similarity between texts. Clustering algorithms and dimension reduction practices are predicated on measuring multidimensional similarity between texts based on word frequencies. The more words that two texts share in similar frequencies, the more similar they are, and the more tightly they cluster together using these methodologies. This is the basis for everything from authorship attribution to topic modeling. In order to computationally assess heteroglossia, therefore, we need to turn these measurements inward to measure not the similarity in semantics between two different texts, but the similarity of a single text to itself. Now, we can do this by breaking a text apart into equal-sized chunks. Here, for example, I've broken Dickens' Bleak House into 5 equal spaces and projected it in a principal component analysis in a virtual space. Again here, distance between each dot, representing 1/5 of Bleak House, is a representation of how similar the language of each of these portions are. We can take the distance, the actual number that represents that dissimilarity. And we can not only do it from one chunk to another chunk, or one section to another section, but we can do it with all sections to each other. We can do this, for example, with Dickens, and then we can take a similar text. This is a PCA of Poe's Telltale Heart, again divided into 5 sections, and take the same measurement. If we add up all of those distances, what we get is what I'm calling an H-score, or a heteroglossia score, which is the total representation, a single number that represents the total differentiation of the various parts of the text from each other. Now, these look actually fairly similar, but when we project them within the same virtual space, what we find is that Dickens has a very, very large range, and poor Poe in the middle has a very, very small range. If we took the actual distances, what we find is that Dickens' text is very, very self-dissimilar, and Poe's is very, very similar. Now, in this example, that's obviously because Dickens' book is very, very long and Poe's is very, very short. That's not a coincidence. I really wanted to illustrate this with a striking visual example. But we can do this with texts that are of the same length. And for those that aren't, we can, as I'll show you, scale those results so that we can compare these numbers simultaneously. According to Bakhtin's theory, therefore, once we work out the difference between length, as I'll show you, we can measure this number overall for each text, and novels, if Bakhtin is right, should have a higher self-dissimilarity, or heterogeneity, or H-score, than poetry, and we should be able to recognize the novels as such because of that. So for this experiment, I sampled a test corpus of 100 novels, 100 works of poetry, and 50 works of nonfiction to test against each other. All works come from the Chadwick-Healy archive, and all were published between 1780 and 1850. I wanted these to be as typographically sound and free from OCR errors as possible. For the poetry texts, I sampled only longer works, either single long poems or single author volumes of poetry. Rather than do what I just showed you here and project each text in its own principal component space, a practice that loses information for the sake of visualization, I instead divided each text into 25 equal parts and measured what's called the callback libeller divergence between each part based on the 5,000 most distinctive words. And this is what a callback libeller divergence looks like. It's a way to assess the relationship between texts. It draws upon information theory and the measurement of what's called relative entropy to measure the amount of information lost when trying to code the features of one text, seen here as a probability distribution, using the features of another text. In other words, if you take one text and you get all of its word frequencies and reduce those to a probability distribution, so the probability that the probability for each word that a randomly drawn word from that text would be that word. What a callback libeller divergence does is say, okay, if we take those set of probabilities and we tried to write another text using those exact same probabilities, how wrong are we? The more wrong we be, the more differences in the language between the two texts, the higher the callback libeller divergence. And you can see here that it forms a symmetrical matrix so that the distance here between fictional text 1 and text 2 is 2.9. 2.9 what? Well, 2.9. The what doesn't actually matter. It's a representation of the virtual difference between those two texts based on their dissimilarity of language by adding all of these numbers up. So here it's a text divided into 10 parts. We get a single similarity score for the entire text. So, what happens when we do this to the corpus? Something that I wasn't expecting. Here, in this histogram, I've given the results for the experiment I proposed. The orange texts are fiction, the green are nonfiction, and the blue are poetry. If Bakhtin's theory had corresponded to my way of testing it, we should find that the fiction should be by far the tallest, and the poetry should be by far the shortest. And yet, this, by the way, is a good lesson in why never to do an analysis the day before you're set to present something at a conference. Because I had a great theory worked out as to how I was going to demonstrate Bakhtin's theory was right, when in fact what I demonstrated to my own satisfaction is that, measured in this way, it's not. In fact, if we take if we reduce that histogram into the average score and do what's called a t-test, which measures whether or not there's a significant difference, there is a shockingly huge difference between what I'm calling the H-score for all of my fictional texts, which is this box here, and especially poetry, which is the blue box at the end. In fact, another interesting thing to note is not only do novels have a highly significant lower index of heteroglossia, as I have defined it, they do so with very little variation between the novels. Unlike fiction, or nonfiction, sorry, or even poetry, which exhibit a wide range of values, all of which are higher than fiction still, the scaled heteroglossial scores of the fiction tend to fall only between 1,000 and 1,400. So, what then are we to make of these results? Bakhtin's heteroglossia has provided an access point to understanding the divergence between prose and poetry. However, the results suggest that the discourse of poetry, insofar as I am approximating it by semantic difference, is far more heterogeneous than that of prose fiction. Does this mean that, contrary to Bakhtin's theory, it is poetry that features multiple interwoven discourse, while the language of the novel exists as a unified whole? Not only does this contradict what we know about the historical formation of the novel, but it also raises additional questions for the way in which I have chosen to model discourse here. In my test of Bakhtin's theory, I have approximated discourse through vocabulary and frequency. Yet discourse itself is a more complex formation that lies outside of mere semantics, as Foucault gestures towards when he refers to discursive events as, quote, a group that is always finite and limited at any moment to the linguistic sequence that have been formulated. Sequence. Sequence here, I argue, is the critical word. As we have seen in the analysis I did of the language of the sublime in Godwin and Shelley, it's the sequence of terms, not merely the fact of their presence or absence, that determines the patterns of poetry and prose that I want to trace. Now, most strategies of quantitative analysis in the digital humanities are uniquely unequipped to analyze sequence. The bag of words model that underlies most of the work of the digital humanities recasts texts as mere words and frequencies, sacrificing any knowledge of the lexical context for each word for the precise information on its frequency. It's almost a Heisenbergian uncertainty principle. You can know how many times a word appears, but you can't know the context simultaneously in which it is embedded. In the final part of my presentation, I want to turn from these digital models of the text as fragmented vocabularies to a new strategy that will allow us to reinsert questions of order into the digital humanities. Now, this strategy was already suggested by the methodological choice that I made in my analysis of Bakhtin's heteroglossia, that is, my use of the callback-Leibler divergence. That metric measures similarity, as I said, through predictability rather than raw frequencies. In other words, how likely is it that we can predict text B from the information on word probabilities in text A, rather than simply how similar are the frequencies of words in both texts A and B. To measure this difference, the callback-Leibler uses a measure of relative entropy rather than distance, a concept that lies at the heart of information science as formulated by Claude Shannon in his groundbreaking mathematical theory of communication. For Shannon, entropy offers a measure of randomness in language, the tendency of a sequence of words, or for Shannon, what he calls bits, to be disordered as opposed to the tendency to repeat, which is measured by the opposite of entropy, redundancy. In Shannon's formulation, the most entropic sentence would be one composed of a sequence of non-repeating random words, as you can see here. The most redundant sentence would be a single word repeated over and over and over. For Shannon, this was a crucial turn in understanding the ways in which communication operates. Together, redundancy and entropy allow us to measure our ability to predict the next term in a sentence, and therefore the information load of a sentence. The higher the redundancy of the text as a whole, the more likely we will be able to correctly predict the next term. Now, English itself already has a degree of redundancy built in. It's the repeating and predictable patterns of language that allow us to make sense of it. We can measure redundancy, therefore, through what's called a Markov chain, a statistical object that allows us to calculate the probability of the next word in a sequence based upon what was happened before. If, for example, I gave you this sentence, with dinner being served, she set herself at the, and asked you to predict what the next word would be, we could have some disagreement, but our collective knowledge of the rules of English would disallow most of its vocabulary. In other words, there are only very few words that would fit the context and grammatical structure of that sentence, the most obvious one being table. We can do this at mentally, at the scale of the sentence. With a computer, we can do this at much, much larger scales, looking at the difference in probabilities not just within a language as a whole, but within specific subsets. For example, by calculating the probabilities of all of the possible sequences in, for example, Wordsworth's poetry, we can use that information to simulate a Wordsworth poem. Here, what I've done is taken Wordsworth's probability of distributions of words following other words and constructed a fake Wordsworth poem. It makes absolutely no grammatical sense, but as one of my colleagues put it when I showed it to him, it still leaves you with an undefinable sense of loss. We can do the same thing in a perhaps more recognizable format with William Blake. Again, making very, very little sense, but for a Blakean scholar, this language, the palindromin called him and by me talk with labor incessant, the eternals he divided in the mills and old, sounds distinctly Blakean. And my personal favorite, which I did just as an experience, Jane Austen, which generated my favorite sentence ever produced by my computer, which is, "I am a mere joke upon my Betty." Although the simulation of such text is an interesting exercise in and of itself, way too interesting, you can waste a lot of time doing this, we can also use Shannon's formula to measure the redundancy of a text or an author itself, thereby giving us a wholly new metric through which to understand literary discourse. While for Shannon, the question of redundancy was purely one of successful communication, the higher redundancy allows information to be communicated more reliably at the expense of information density. For literature, it offers something entirely different. As we, as literary scholars, understand, literary language is not one of simple communication. When Anna Barbeau writes, quote, "Still the loud death drum thundering from afar, o'er the vexed nations pours the storm of war," she's not merely saying that we are at war. Instead, her particular word choices and the order of her syntax communicates to the reader the nature of that war and her sentiments upon it, setting up the first movement to her poem, 1811. For literary texts, Shannon's redundancy is not a measure of success in communication, but an inherent part of the process of literary communication itself. By measuring the redundancy of a text, therefore, we can capture something that has been unavailable to literary criticism and which lies below the threshold of reader comprehension, the linguistic regularity of an author's discourse. Something that is implicated in both topicality and the formal features of the text, yet something that is different from either. Rather than communication theory, this is something that is perhaps captured best in criticism by William Empson's ambiguity, or perhaps better, the idea of dependent variabilities that I.A. Richard offers as a defining characteristic of poetry in the philosophy of rhetoric. At the same time, it's not a universal quality of poetry, but a deeply historically contingent metric of poetic language. It is related, I argue, to the, quote, tension and difference between the semiotic sphere and the semantic sphere that Giorgio Agamben reads into Paul Valéry's definition of poetry. And it captures in part what Roman Jakobson terms the axis of selection and variation. Jakobson, in fact, pointed towards the sympathy between the then burgeoning field of information theory and poetics in a 1960 essay called Linguistics and Communication Theory, and although he and Tomaszewski experimented with Markov chains around the same time, their lack of computational power quickly shelved their ambitions. Now, even while this measure represents something radically new, the importance it places on word order reflects a critical 18th century concern in poetics. In a series of Spectator essays on Milton's Paradise Lost, Joseph Addison praises Milton for, quote, making use of the idioms of other tongues, particularly the transposition of words which this poet has naturalized to give his verse the greater sound and throw it out of prose. In his claim that Milton's play with word order is both more poetic and something that is foreign to English, Addison is reiterating a common critical trope of the period. The debate over syntax and the poetic tendencies of a language became a key component of the nationalistic debates over language throughout the century. Found in the work of Klopstock, Hamann, and Herder, and here I'm drawing on the work of Aldo Scaglione in German and Ulrich Reichen in French. The operating theory lay in the relationship between the flexibility of word order and poetic suitability. Languages that were more rigid in their word order were better suited for exactness, for philosophy and science, while those whose word order could be manipulated without losing the meaning of the sentence, primarily Latin but also Italian, or to a lesser degree French, were more poetic. As Diderot says in his Lettres sur le sourd-muet, in not having inversions, we have gained sharpness, clarity, precision, essential qualities for discourse, and we have lost warmth, eloquence, and energy. The index of repetition, orderliness, and repeatability that a measure of informational redundancy offers, therefore, is coextensive with the index of poetics that Diderot alludes to. With reference to this work, therefore, on the scale of redundancy, poetry should be, again, much lower than prose. Moreover, by measuring the relative discursive redundancy of both poetry and prose across time, we can map how the relationship changes throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So for this test, I assembled a much larger corpus of texts written between 1700 and 1900. It includes 1,823 prose texts from the 18th century by British authors, from both the Chadwick-Healy collection and the 18th century collections online, and 2,766 novels from the 19th century, all of them also by British authors, from, again, the Chadwick-Healy collection, but also here with the Internet Archive and some of Project Gutenberg. Given the lengths of these texts, I was able to compute the redundancy score for each novel. For poetry, however, the length of most individual texts is far too short to calculate with any accuracy. The shorter the text, the less chance that any individual sequence will repeat. And so I calculated the redundancy on a by-author basis rather than by text, using only authors with more than 10 works in the Chadwick-Healy Poetry Archive, which left me with 700 poets and 131,459 individual poems, so still operating on a much, much larger scale. I divided both corpora into 5 periods: early 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, mid-19th century, and late 19th century. For the novels, this was based on the date of composition, and for the poets, since I'm using their poetic corpora rather than individual works, I used the mean date of their period of poetic composition. Using the distribution of probabilities from my Markov model, I then calculated a single redundancy score for each novel and each poet. In his initial work, Shannon calculated the redundancy of written, non-literary prose English to be about 50%, giving me a baseline against which to measure both kinds of literary writing. The initial results from the analysis, I think, are incredibly striking. Across both corpora, the mean redundancy of the poetry was a full 4% lower than that of prose. It's a little small, but here, again, the red is novels or prose fiction, and the blue is poetry. Here, the index on the y-axis is redundancy. The lower the value, the less redundant the text is. The higher the value, the more redundant it is. If I wanted this to sound a little sexier, I would have called it entropy and turned the graph upside down and said that the lower, the more entropic, and the higher, the less entropic. But redundancy here gives us a way to access these concepts with a degree of meaning that we can translate into critical interpretability. What you can see from this graph is that, in fact, poetry is much, much less redundant than prose. Moreover, both of these values are significantly lower than the redundancy of spoken English as predicted by Shannon. This means 2 things. First, this metric actually does capture a key and significant discursive difference between poetry and prose, and moreover, the 18th century aesthetic theorists were correct. The index of poetics maps onto the index of redundancy. The less order and repetition within the sequence of a text, the more poetic. The divergence here from the formal properties of poetry is crucial. The repeating structure of verse form and syllabic scheme makes the structure of poetry more formulaic, even while the play of language renders the discourse of poetry far less predictable. This also begins to shed light on the results from the previous test of heteroglossia. As the discourse of poetry is significantly more variable than that of prose, it stands to reason that the distance between different parts of the same poem, based upon language alone, should be greater than between novels. It is, however, when we move from a static view of the total corpus into the historical patterns of redundancy that this method truly begins to reveal new information. Here, we can see that the redundancy of both poetry and prose does not remain constant, but instead varies across the 2 centuries represented by my sample. Here, each dot is either a poetic corpus or a novel, and it's placed on the timeline according to its date. And again, it's a little small, and I apologize, but the red or pink texts are novels, and the blue texts are poetic corpora. The vertical position is again a function of its redundancy score. We can clearly see the 2 dominant trends across the period. Throughout the 18th century, the individual redundancy of both poetry and prose remains relatively constant, although poetry experiences a small but significant rise towards prose at the beginning of the 19th century. After 1800, however, prose texts suddenly fall in redundancy by an entire percent, over 1/4 of the distance between the 2 groups. The language of prose in the late Romantic period, in other words, becomes something that looks much more like poetry. At the end of the century, however, the opposite occurs. Even while the movement of prose towards poetry has slowed, poetry, again relatively suddenly, becomes much more like prose as it approaches the 20th century. And we get, for example, things like free verse. This new story of the convergence of poetry and prose throughout the long 18th and 19th centuries both confirms and rewrites much of what we thought we knew about these genres. In Lyric Generations, for example, Gabrielle Starr discusses how the lyric responded in the 18th century to the increase in prose fiction by adopting both its form and content. Here, It is prose at the beginning of the 19th century that undergoes a shift, transforming its formerly philosophic or journalistic discourse into a highly aestheticized language, at precisely the moment at which current theories of the novel place its emergence within a fully modern form. Now, a closer look at the individual trends resolves the differences between texts and authors into meaningful patterns. Here, only the novels are visualized, and the colors indicate the membership of each text within each of my 5 periods. Again, 1700 to 1750, 1700 to 1800, 1800 to 1833, 1833 to 66, and 66 to 1900. What is particularly interesting and will require further investigation through the course of this project is the relative position of canonical authors throughout the history revealed by this metric. For example, while the early 19th century is characterized by a significant drop in the redundancy of novels, which I have characterized as the aestheticization of novelistic discourse, the leaders in this trend are highly significant. Among the novels with the lowest redundancy scores are canonical novels, particularly those, interestingly, by female authors, including Anne Radcliffe, Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, Elizabeth Inchbald, and most notably, Jane Austen. Clearly, there is a gender dimension to this metric that requires further exploration. The incredibly close proximity of Frankenstein and Northanger Abbey in this graph also reveals that the language of the Gothic too is implicated in the aestheticization of novelistic discourse. In fact, and I hesitated to show this to you because I'm not entirely sure what it means and it terrifies me. Here, again, is just the novels, and here it's just the novels between 1800 and 1900, colored for whether or not the novels have appeared in a Norton, Broadview, or Oxford edition. In other words, the blue novels are canonical novels. The red novels are archive novels. I, a good student of John Guillory, was raised to believe that the canon was nothing more than a fiction assembled at the beginning of the 20th century through syllabi in English schools. And yet, when completely unintentionally I decided to test this, what I found is that there is a distinct difference between canonical texts and non-canonical texts. I'm not sure what to make of it. I'm not willing to say anything about it yet. It's actually forming a centerpiece of one of the projects we have on the go at the Literary Lab called, appropriately enough, Canon Archive. But the difference is striking enough that I wanted to share it with you. Now, in the poetry corpus, much less terrifying, here visualized by period and without the novels, the relative position of canonical authors is also notable, although here for its indications of changes in canonicity across the period. In the early 18th century, once again, highly canonical and popular texts appear far below average, particularly as you can see those by Edward Young, Alexander Pope, and James Thomson. Now, by the Romantic period, the poetry of Charlotte Turner Smith, Coleridge, Byron, Keats, and Southey all appear near the median for their period, a significant shift for the canonical authors of the time. We can potentially take this as active evidence for the departure of the Romantic period authors from their predecessors. Wordsworth's call for poetry in, quote, the real language of men, or the real language of nature, in the preface to the lyrical ballads, is being expressed by the authors of the period in a movement away from the highly poeticized discourse of the 18th century. Again, since the metric of redundancy that I have developed here bears traces of both the formal features of the text and the content that they express, it is uniquely suited, I argue, to gauge the larger scale effects of poetic theories, such as that offered by Wordsworth, as they propagate throughout the corpus. Finally, and perhaps most striking, is the gender divide among these poets. While, as I noted, the male Romantic poets tend to cluster around the mean redundancy of values for the Romantic period, the two most popular female poets, Felicia Hemans and Letitia Elizabeth Landon, appear far at the bottom of the chart. In fact, Hemans is by a significant margin the least redundant author in the entire corpus. Susan Wolfson in Borderlines points towards a possible explanation in Hemans' complex and gendered relationship to both her public and her critics. Conscious as she was of her public staging of gender and her economic and critical success, Hemans pitched her poetry to appeal to a wide audience whose expectations for good poetry had been set, as William Sinclair describes, by the 18th century canon. A tangible portion of her success, therefore, was due to her highly poeticized style, one that both won her public acclaim and ran counter to Wordsworth's performance of the, quote, poet of nature. If we can equate, as I argue here, a low redundancy with a high poetic valuation, an indicator of a poet's ability to generate a reading based on semantic surprise, that is, our inability to predict what words will come next, then this new history recasts Hemans as one of the most significant practitioners of verse in the Romantic English canon. To Wolfson's account of Wordsworth and Byron's critical disdain for Hemans is added, therefore, the idea that the charges of domesticity leveled against her are an attempt to legislate a linguistic innovativeness that is all at once highly canonical and highly modern, as opposed to the relative discursive regularity of the male Romantic poets. Now, the complexity of these diagrams are such that a full exploration of even the most significant trends lies outside the scope of this talk. To conclude, therefore, I want to return to the specific problem which prompted this investigation, in order to briefly figure out what the new understanding of poetic redundancy can tell us about the difference between the way that Shelley and Godwin deploy the language of the sublime. Here, returning to the actual language of the passages, we can begin to articulate the differences in the work of both. The low redundancy of poetry, as I've shown, is an indicator of its dependent variabilities, its tendency to vary both the sequence of words and the words themselves in a relatively small space. Prose, by contrast, is marked by a series of repetitions. It functions through repeated patterns of discourse that cycle back to familiar formulations. Here, we can see this working at the level of the text. Shelley's poem, even when it does repeat, does so only to vary the pattern of its discourse, making meaning through difference. For example, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor. In each case, we get a repetition of now, but what comes after is determinately radically different than the last time it repeats. Godwin's text, on the other hand, draws from the same language repeatedly as Godwin reiterates his theory. Caleb speaks of the mind as endowed with powers that might enable it to laugh at the tyrant's vigilance. He describes the juvenile mind as coveting the power of extortions. Mind is juxtaposed to the power of man and the power of thinking. The power of mind is Godwin's subject, and he returns to this formulation repeatedly throughout his discourse. Shelley arguably has the same theme, but his technique is one of repetition through variation. He describes his, quote, human mind, his wild thoughts, which are then displaced into the mountain, where Shelley is assured exists a solemn power, equivalent to the river that ceaselessly bursts and raves. Both employ the language of the sublime, but while both use similar numbers of unique words, the vast majority of sublime words in Godwin's texts are mind and power, together accounting for almost 40%. By contrast, Shelley never repeats a sublime word, with the exception, more than 4 times across the poem. The highest is dark, which occurs 4 times. He varies his language through the complex structure of metaphor and poetic diction. On a historical scale, the metric of redundancy has revealed new macroscopic trends in poetry and prose, while at the level of the individual work, it reveals the ways in which discourse functions between highly prosaic and highly poetic texts. Among the challenges of the digital humanities in the near future will be to find such parsimonious and meaningful techniques that are able to use the wealth of knowledge in literary criticism and literary theory to uncover new kinds of knowledge at all scales of reading. Much of digital humanities so far has been dedicated to using the new methods offered by such practices of quantitative analysis to put pressure on received literary theories, and this talk is no exception given the challenge that I've tried to pose to both Bakhtin's theory of heteroglossia and our history of reading the work of poetry and prose as if they are equivalent. Yet, what I hope I have also shown is that a deep knowledge and attention to the critical and theoretical knowledge of the discipline, combined with new kinds of metrics and knowledges that are available only through the kinds of methods that I have demonstrated here, can also aid us in thinking through new approaches to literature that are all at once effective, meaningful, and responsible to the discipline as a whole.
Mark will answer the question.
Really enjoyed it. Stunning diagram with the blue line under the red line in terms of the difference between canonical and non-canonical. My question is in part perhaps caused by my own shadowy apprehension of Bakhtin, but heterogeneity and heteroglossia seem like, as the talk indicates, radically different concepts. So too, I think redundancy, or rather entropy and heteroglossia are substantially different concepts too. If heteroglossia is the convergence or interaction of different discourses, wouldn't the model that would be best for analyzing the co-presence of different discourses be more like the discussion of the sublime, where you would have relatively coherent spheres defining an individual discourse, coming into contact or conflict with other discourses which are socially defined or associated with different classes or groups? Because then you would have different social discourses conflicting with each other. Because it's not really an example of heteroglossia for an upper middle class white man to have a conversation with another upper class middle class white man, where one person is talking about IKEA lamps and using that discourse, and the other one is talking about parts for a Volkswagen, where you would get radically different measures of heterogeneity and redundancy, but you would have a discourse that is in a way uniform and monologic.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. And part of the danger of digital humanities is that we tend to paint with a very broad brush. And given World Enough and Time, as I work on this project, I think that's exactly what I'd like to get at, a way of modeling discourse like I do with the sublime, but at a much larger scale. Well, both at a larger scale in terms of more kinds of discourse and a smaller scale in terms of within an individual text. What's interesting about that example that you bring up, though, and the way in which this is trying to measure it, and the reason that I am okay discussing heteroglossia as a kind of heterogeneity, is that the words that make the difference when you're measuring the distances between discourses, and remember, I'm using the most frequent distinctive words, are not lamp versus, I forget what the other one is, IKEA lamps and what?
Volkswagen.
Volkswagen.
So carburetor.
Right. So lamp and carburetor aren't even going to come into that analysis, right? The words that actually make the difference, and this is something we learned from authorship attribution, are actually the, I don't want to say this because this is what authorship attribution people call words that are content-free and used unconsciously. And I argue no words are content-free, and we never use them unconsciously. But words that we don't think of as carrying that kind of meaning, which is to say, if you have a discourse between two white men, and one is talking about lamps from IKEA and one is talking about Volkswagen cars, the subject actually doesn't matter that much. What matters is the way in which they vocalize that subject, the words that they use, the order in which they put the syntax together. The reason that I'm comfortable looking at heteroglossia in this way is that when you get a divergence, it tends to be at that level of non-content specific words. So, for example, the kind of radical differentiation would be Scott, right? Where you have discourses written in Scots dialect and discourses written in contemporary English of the early 19th century. That would be hugely different on the metric. And I would argue, actually, a good example of heteroglossia, where you have two different people from two different social spheres, from two different nationalities, trying to talk and failing to talk to each other. So that's what it's designed to capture. And the fact that it's actually poetry wherein that language tends to be much more widely dispersed, or that way of looking at language tends to be much more widely dispersed, is the reason that, you know, I'm more comfortable saying that I think it's not perfect yet. I agree. But I think, I feel, and I argue that I'm coming closer to capturing, I think, something closer to heteroglossia.
That's great.
This is another sort of limitation question in a way, because it feels like this is very new for me, thinking about this and then thinking about ordering, trying to find schema that would help you articulate what we're used to doing analytically on levels that are more complex often in some ways, like, because this is schematic. So like I'm thinking about, for instance, when you're talking about the sublime as word choice, that feels like a very limited way, in a certain way of understanding the sublime. Like when you look at that poem example, for me, the start of that poem, the reason it becomes more sublime is it starts off as a metaphor, and then it switches into like an actual physical description of this river, and you're kind of like dizzied a little bit in the change of register between figurative and literal description, and there's also sonic effects that kind of the repetition of arv and ever and so on and so forth. So like we're used to, as literary critics, sort of analysing a kind of an array of effects that aren't located in words. They could be sound patterns where you find differences, or they could be, and you're getting some of that near the end. You talk about the metaphor, very the last moment of your talk, and so I guess I'm wondering, like this feels very like one has to start somewhere, and someone has to sort of begin, and it seems like it's a tremendous amount of work to get this far too. Like, I mean, just in terms of the presentation, it's really interesting and helpful in many ways. But I'm wondering, like, how you cope with the limitations and how you see going forward, like what kinds of linguistic effects you'd like to be able to include, like what the limitations are of picking a word when so much of literature is about transforming, like, I don't know, dealing with words in other ways other than their semantic or communicative content.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the part where I enter on information theory, for me, the interesting part is the ways in which literature is not purely communicative, right? Like, if literature existed solely to deliver an ideal message to you, then the measures that I'm using, for example, with redundancy and entropy, would be meaningless. It would just be a sort of Roman Jakobson return to the phatic function that, you know, judged whether or not the communication was successful. For me, the interest in using metrics like redundancy, which should measure something like successful, you know, the degree of success of communication, is much more interesting when applied to literature, because I want to argue that literature is communicating so much more than simply the content of the words. So my turn towards the kind of information theory metrics is a kind of first step towards something that looks more like what you're talking about, I'm hoping. That said, the much larger question, I like to tell my students that, well, there's a couple things I like to tell my students. Some of which I'm going to repeat here, and some of which I'm not. The digital humanities investigation that ends with a graph is a bad digital humanities investigation, right? The point of these methods is that they should give us new ways of accessing the texts. A graph becomes a kind of interpretable object that we can add to our reading of the poem or the novel or a group of poems or a group of novels that lets us understand it in different ways. And this is exactly what, you're absolutely right, I was trying to allude to at the end of the talk. Once I have a theory of poetic communication, that, for example, romantic poetry particularly deals much, or tries to deal with, or tries to communicate what it's trying to communicate through variation in language and a kind of non-repetition, then I can go back and look at the metaphoric structure of Shelley's poem and say, you know, yeah, I can sort of see how that works when reading through the metaphors, or when reading through how the sonic landscape of that poem in particular changes. So that while I am trying to capture something more subtle and more, I think, in tune with literary criticism than traditional DH, which does nothing but bag of words type analysis, which I find limited in many ways. So part of my goal is to try and get beyond that. I also am deeply sensitive to the fact that of a digital humanities investigation, assembling the corpus, writing the code, running the code, getting the graphs, or whatever the output happens to be, is only the first and not the most complicated step. The real work is when you get that, interpreting it, and returning to the literature itself in order to come up with a theory of why the things look like what they look like. And only by combining those two halves, I think, can you actually begin to use these methods in a way that can be not just responsible literary criticism, but deeply, deeply productive.
I just wanted to say thank you. I sat back here before you started talking, and I kind of turned off a little bit because I saw the dots, and I was like, I don't do dots, I do words. And I was pleasantly surprised. I thought your talk and all of the work you've done is incredibly insightful and really provocative. So thank you for making me appreciate dots. That was really good. But my question is more related to, I guess, the pedagogical deployment of this type of work. You mentioned things that you say to your students. So how much of this do you incorporate into your classes with your students, and in what's your purpose with that?
Depends very much on the class. So my very, very, very favorite classes to teach are not strictly methodological classes, although I do teach those, and those are absolutely necessary for giving people a foundation in these kinds My very, very favorite ones to teach are the ones that take a specific literary problem or set of questions and come up with a very narrow set of these kinds of methodologies that I can use, or we can use as a class to explore them, so that the students wind up learning the basics of a narrow set of methodologies, but, and this is the critical part, ones that they know how to immediately apply within our discipline. Otherwise, I mean, there are better places, certainly on my campus, where you could go learn computer science or you could go learn statistics than in my class. But there's no better place on campus, I would argue, that you could learn to apply computer science or statistics to responsible literary criticism than the classes I offer. So, for example, I just finished teaching a class on network analysis. But the goal of that class was to look at how the social formations of early 18th century and late 17th century plays and novels responded to, reflected, or resisted the social formations in the real world that people such as Habermas or Porter argue are responsible for the Enlightenment. So we spent a few classes learning how to use network analysis tools to build networks and extract networks out of plays. But the real goal was to say, okay, now we've got a network. What does it look like? How does it either suggest a kind of similarity to the rise of the public sphere, the emergence of bourgeoisie, or how does it kind of resist that in the case of a lot of restoration dramas? So for me, the best kinds, and I've actually taught some of this stuff before, sublime stuff, not in a course on the sublime, but rather how to use this kind of topological visualization in order to assess what a discourse looks like as it evolves over a period. And so we learned very specifically how to do that, how to read them, but only within the context of, what does this tell us about the literature?
Thank you for a wonderful talk. So I was really struck by the, and I'm going to have to ask you at dinner about this phrase about the algorithmic criticism.
Algorithmic criticism.
And this idea of deforming the text, which is a way of making the text alien or strange, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing it in a new way. And I was really struck by the way in some of the early models you were showing us, this kind of analysis seemed to be enabling a really nuanced historical understanding, a sort of evolution of discourse. I'm wondering, is the ability to understand the text in a way that it has never been understood before, including a way that it couldn't have been understood by the producers and consumers at a particular moment, does that ever make you feel nervous? Are there any dangers that you perceive in, some sort of like presentist view, or is it all gravy, or are there some risks there? What do you think?
I tend to focus on the grave side of it. But
Sure.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's really easy because no one has done a lot of this stuff before.
Yeah.
To do new stuff. And figuring out what the new stuff that's good versus the new stuff that's, potentially visually striking but not that interesting is difficult. So, plus side, going back to the pedagogical side of things, I can tell a class of students, like for example the network one I just taught, or one of the grotesque that I taught a while ago, that we're going to be doing stuff that no one has done before. So the research we produce while sitting in this class is going to be brand new, which is a really great thing. But, as you say, grain of salt. So, for example, one of the easiest things to figure out through this kind of analysis is that different authors write differently. Which is 100% absolutely true. And if you're not careful with how you generate a visualization, that's all it will show. And it's not that interesting. So figuring out the nuances of the representation, of how you're deforming, to use Ramsey's phrase again, the text, that takes a careful understanding of the methods, but it also takes a really careful understanding of the things that you are analyzing with the methods. Corpus building is really difficult. And in order to figure out what these methods are pointing to, you have to know what went into them, right? So it takes a lot of study to figure out, 18th century, to pose a question about, for me, 18th century discourse and to figure out how I want to test it and figure out what text I want to test it in, then get the result and very, very sternly, critically examine it for, okay, what could this possibly be, and eliminate the usual suspects. I've been trying to disprove that one with the canon and the archive. So first I thought, oh, well, this is, of course, OCR. So I looked at the texts, and it turned out not to be OCR. And I said, aha, it's type-token ratio. It's a greater variability. And in fact, the type-token ratio is reversed. Archival texts use many more different words than canonical texts. And every time I try and disprove it, the reason I feel remotely comfortable presenting it is because I've really, really been trying hard to figure out a way in which I messed up, and that isn't right. But it keeps defeating me. And so those kinds of exercises, which I think are somewhat familiar to us, but not completely, those are really necessary in order to separate the wheat from the chaff, this kind of analysis, right? The gravy from the not gravy. And those kinds of practices, I think, are really, really important. It's really tempting to stand up and say, aha, I've made a brand new discovery, and everyone should use this from now on. And it's really important to resist that temptation and really look critically at what it is you're producing.
I wondered, I noticed when you moved to the redundancy entropy study that the nonfiction vanished.
Yeah.
Have you run some of the nonfiction? I'm curious about how it compares to the other stuff.
I actually have a piece, it's on a blog, not my blog, one run by Chad Wellman, that I co-wrote with Andrew Piper, who's a former collaborator of mine, I guess a current collaborator, in which we looked at the difference between the New York Times book review and academic articles using these metrics. And we wanted to see if, in fact, who was the more redundant. And it turns out, if I'm remembering correctly, that the New York Times book review is, in fact, the far more redundant of the two. So yes, I've done it. It turns out that Shannon was, as I probably should have guessed, right. Nonfiction tends to be more redundant than either poetry or prose. But again, it really depends on the genre of nonfiction that you test. So one of the things that I'm doing is working with a few people outside of my discipline. It's one of the advantages of being a digital humanist. I get to sort of travel every once in a while and figure out how the kinds of things we do in literary studies actually are highly applicable to other forms of study. So I'm working with a legal scholar from the Northeast. I think he's actually now the director of the Climate Change Law Center at Columbia. And we have a project on the Supreme Court. And we're looking at decisions in the Supreme Court to see if there are patterns of language that predict whether or not a decision will be environmentally protective or non-environmentally protective. And it turns out that of the things we discovered, none of which are interesting for the study yet, Supreme Court language is incredibly redundant. It's funny enough when it's Scalia. He's less redundant than the others, which is interesting. So in fact, I've looked in a couple of cases at what nonfiction looks like. And it's interesting. It's really interesting. But it takes a while to do this, and it takes a while to calculate this. So I haven't done a period nonfiction sample at the same scale that I've done poetry and prose, but it's something that was definitely on my radar.
Does it top 50? Does it go above 50 in nonfiction?
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, 50 is a good average. It depends, like I said, the genres are very, very, very variable. But yeah, it absolutely. New York Times book review is much higher.
Yeah, question. I really enjoyed your talk because I've actually dabbled in some digital humanities work myself, but on TV, not on literature. And your talk is a great model of how you can present that sort of information in a way that's really comprehensible, and et cetera, et cetera. So the question I had actually went to one of the first, if you wouldn't mind going back a few slides, one of the first historical models you had. Oh, I think that was it.
The redundancy?
Forward. Yeah, when I looked at this, one of the things that struck me was how the blue ones are poetry, right?
Yep.
It seemed that in the early part, there's a lot of deviation between the dots, and then they seem to kind of come together. Did you? Is that borne out by the numbers, and do you see any significance in the way that So in a way, it all seems to sort of come together as the decades move on.
Kind of convergence. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm interested in the fact that overall the two are converging. Yes.
I mean, just the blue dots seem to be converging.
It is. Well, I mean, this is just the poetry. This is the poetry without the prose. And they are, but it's not as much as you'd think. So it's slightly significantly more or less variable.
Yeah.
But not enough that I'm willing to hang anything on it.
Okay.
It's a good observation, though, and I think you're right. What's tricky is that I have more poems from the 19th century than I do from the 18th century. And it tends to make it look it tends to exaggerate that effect because most poems tend towards the middle of the analysis. So it looks like, I think, the stuff that comes later is tighter. And it is, like I said, slightly, but I still haven't worked out if that's just because there are more poems or something.
Yeah, but I think it illustrates how a visualization like that can tell you something that you couldn't get just looking at the numbers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, visualization is really important to the kind of work that we do. But like responsible visualization is kind of important because, and this goes back to the question of gravy, you can do a lot of really interesting things with visualizations that can suggest things that might not be borne up by the numbers. And conversely, sometimes the numbers will indicate like a crazy high significance when a visualization doesn't really look like there's that much of a difference. But yeah, it's really important. And I find this is why I moved to the topologies. When I first did the Sublime project, I really just was working with word lists, and the notion that you could take those and create something like this. I didn't notice that there were these kind of tectonic shifts in the discourse of the Sublime. I didn't realize that Burke's discourse came together at a particular point until I actually visualized it like this and then just looked at it kind of historically. So that was something I figured out only because I visualized it.
If there are no more questions, please thank